This summer, a little movie called Weapons came out, written and directed by a man named Zach Cregger. And Weapons inspired a lot of discourse and analysis that I've sort of wanted to talk about since the movie came out, but couldn't quite find the right in. But then, well, long story short, I found the right in, and here we are. Many people have provided different readings of this film that the director, Zach Cregger, has sort of blanketly dismissed as wrong. Zach Cregger insists that there is no intentional meaning to many of the film's more provocative moments, but, like, is this true? And if it is true or not true, does that matter? Should a director explain things if no one likes their movie, or if everybody does like their movie? Is the film too vague, as critic John Pastelli alludes to in this piece, or is it a bluntly on-the-nose, post-woke masterpiece, as Nora Kenny from the American Conservative writes? And finally, do all of these questions and open-endedness basically confirm that the film is bad and open to some well-deserved criticism? So first of all, before I get too deep into the analysis of the film from my own perspective and also including other perspectives, I want to first talk about something we do know. Zach Cregger lost one of his close friends prior to writing this film, and he's talked about this film being the result of working through that grief in a couple different ways. Per an article's interview, I guess, in Vanity Fair, Cregger said, "I was very wrapped up in that, and it was just an absolutely devastating event. Rather than totally self-destruct, I can't drink and do drugs anymore. My only way to engage with these really intense feelings is through creativity. I get to write these characters that are feeling kind of what I'm feeling. Something precious is gone, and everyone is left to just deal with it." That was the jumping off point. But regardless of what you think of the importance of his inspiration, some of his other comments on the film, I think that an important element to keep in mind when looking at Weapons and the discourse around it is an old idea that I've talked about before on this channel called the death of the author, which is basically a form of literary thought which was more or less coined or outlined by the French critic Roland Barthes. Might have said his last name wrong, but who cares? Basically, in The Death of the Author, according to Barthes, only the author really knows the meaning behind a text, and therefore they should not actually matter, because that definitive meaning or purpose is very limiting of the reader's personal experience and ability to engage with the text. Here's Barthes in his own words from Death of the Author. "The reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. Yet this destination cannot any longer be personal. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. Classic criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. For it, the writer is the only person in literature. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." And personally, I'm a really big fan of this. I've always loved the idea of the death of the author, that all that matters is the text, the movie, the book, the song, whatever it is that you have in front of you, because it requires the text to, as Cormac McCarthy once famously said, speak for itself without the need of the author to editorialize. And I've brought this up in criticism against authors like J.K. Rowling or even Rick Riordan, who feel the need oftentimes to add their own perspective onto a book or change events or canon or whatever it is, which to me indicates that you are not confident in what you actually wrote and in your writing's ability to, well, speak for itself. And based on the comments that I've read from him in different interviews I've watched, it seems that Cregger is, in a way, a fan of this reading of the work as well, or of this theory, I guess I should say. Cregger's removal of himself from the text and his refusal to give kind of a specific stamp on it makes the text more interesting. To once again quote Cormac McCarthy, Zach Cregger is basically saying that the books, or in this case the film, speaks for itself. And yes, the film does speak for itself, but are we lying if we pretend that it all means nothing, Mr. Cregger? And I think this kind of open-ended approach that Cregger in the film takes is what's lent itself to some criticism or people who don't like the film or feel that it's incomplete, inconclusive, unsatisfactory, whatever. Basically, this is a film that does not spoon-feed the audience, which is something I like. Cregger intentionally leaves much open to interpretation, and he's not interested in explicit explanation. And I think this is a turn-off for many viewers, and as a sign of something that's not fully thought through or thought out, which maybe Cregger would agree with. And the reason I want to focus on criticism a little bit, and the main reason actually behind me making this video, is actually a letter that one of my students wrote to me over the summer that he typed on a typewriter, which was very epic. And he wanted me to kind of give him a rebuttal and a response because he knew that I really liked weapons, and he did not like weapons. And so this video is months in the making for this student, who we will refer to throughout this video simply as Jay. So I am going to focus this criticism section on some notes that Jay gave me in his letter talking about the film. So here we go. Here's what a high schooler thought of the movie. Not a fan. Firstly, the message. Obviously, school shootings. More specifically, I think it is school shootings are caused by the home, not the kid. But the message and the film seem like they are separate things. Like, in the writer room, they thought that the synopsis was really good. Then they wrote the film, but oh wait, they forgot there was a metaphor. So to make it better, they just add a huge gun in the sky for no reason. And he writes some other things, and he, is a smart kid, but this is kind of the main point that he made and that I wanted to address. And first of all, like, I agree that this is totally one of the messages of the movies. Like, I don't think Jay is wrong. But unlike for Jay, like, this message worked for me. Like, it felt fleshed out enough. And I think that Jay is a little off about the writing process behind the metaphors and such, as I'll cover later, but his response to it is seemingly in line with what Zach Cregger would want from a response. It's just probably a little bit more narrow or reductive than Cregger would want. Jay also had some other criticisms regarding the tone and the magic system, and specifically that the tone is incohesive and that the magic system doesn't make sense. And I agree that the tone is inconsistent, but I think that in the second half of the film, the tone, the hard shift to violently comedic, is meant to serve as a type of catharsis, which I'll discuss more later. But as for the magic system, Mr. J, I do have this to say. I agree that it has holes, but it makes enough sense and is consistent enough that it doesn't really matter to me. Basically, you have two different types of magic systems. You have hard magic systems, which are explained with a lot of rules, and you have soft magic systems, which are irrelevant and the rules only matter when it's convenient to the plot, basically. And I think that this is on the harder side of soft in a way, mainly because we're given visual rules as to how the spells and such work. What? But to me, like, it doesn't really matter that it makes sense, only that it is consistent. And I feel that the magic and the spells in the film are consistent. There's a Grant Morrison quote that I really love that I think applies expertly not just to comic books, but to horror as well. And basically, Grant Morrison says that, like, the rules and things don't matter because it's fake and we should understand it as fake. Specifically, he wrote that adults struggle desperately with fiction, demanding constantly to conform to the rules of everyday life. Adults foolishly demand to know how Superman can possibly fly, or how Batman can possibly run a multi-billion-dollar business empire during the day and fight crime at night, when the answer is obvious even to the smallest child. Because it's not real. And to me, this is something that makes horror, and specifically weapons, scarier. You can't always explain what you're afraid of. Sometimes your fear is childish, and sometimes what you're afraid of isn't real. But sometimes what you're afraid of is real. But it's abstract. It's impossible to confront, explain, or overcome. And that, I think, is where the true horror of weapons lies. And so now begins our full deep dive explanation into, I guess, the main metaphor that my student Jay had umbrage with, and which a lot of other people had umbrage with. And so, Jay, I hope that this video is what you're looking for. And if not, we'll talk about it during class. So let's just jump right into the floating gun in the room. So partway through the film, one of our main characters, Archer, has this dream which involves a floating gun and the numbers 217 above a house at night. And a lot of people have said a lot of things about this gun, but let's look at what Zach Cregger himself has said about this gun. That's my rule for myself. If I start getting too thoughtful, I tend to write something boring. My whole philosophy is to try and eliminate me from the process. Turn my brain completely off and let my subconscious take over, and just be a conduit, incorporating what you get from your subconscious into your art and leaving it alone. Then, of the gun specifically, Cregger said, "The fact that I don't understand it is what makes it so important to me." And from what he's saying there, you might believe that my student Jay is right. Is the gun there for, as Jay said, no reason? Is it a shoddy metaphor? Well, I think it's more complicated than that. And to explain why, we need to address something called transcendental meditation. Transcendental meditation is, well, exactly what it sounds like. It's a form of meditation which Zach Cregger is a fan of, and he's not the first director to be a fan of this. Per the official website of Transcendental Meditation regarding David Lynch's relationship with Transcendental Meditation, Transcendental Meditation is an effortless technique, practiced for 20 minutes twice a day. It is a silent technique, practiced in a comfortable sitting position with the eyes closed. During the Transcendental Meditation technique, the mind is able to access deeper levels of consciousness thanks to a mantra provided by a certified teacher during the TM course. TM allows the body and mind to process accumulated stress, resulting in sharper thinking, better sleep, and less anxiety, among many other benefits. David Lynch learned the TM technique in 1973, and has stated that he didn't miss a single meditation session since learning. He gave credit to the TM technique for his creativity, energy, and happiness. And I think when you look at the film through this lens, it makes a lot of sense, specifically when taking into account that Cregger was writing this as a way to process some trauma and grief over the loss of a close friend. But it's also relevant in the sense that David Lynch was famous for refusing to explain or really elaborate on his films.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
We'll elaborate on that.
No, I won't.
So with all that in mind, we cannot count on Zach Cregger to tell us what the gun means. So instead, we've got to kind of figure it out itself, if it even means anything. And I think it does mean something. First of all, it's a weapon, obviously, like the title of the movie. But if you're looking at the literal explanation of it within the film's narrative, there's a poster on Maddie's room, which is the son of Archer, who is played by Josh Brolin, who's the one who has the dream of the gun. And Archer is sleeping in his son's room because, well, he misses his son. His son vanished. And this gun is on a poster within the room. So he's seeing it when he wakes up and when he goes to bed. So it makes sense that it would be in the character's mind. But more broadly, I guess, and more interestingly, to me and many others, like, the gun is an obvious symbol of school shootings. And I personally don't think that the gun is there for no reason, no matter what Cregger or Jay may say. To really understand this specific weapon, we need to ask ourselves, what are the real weapons of weapons? Here's what Zach Cregger had to say about the title during an interview with Vanity Fair. I always like a title that's opaque. I think it invites you to consider the movie one layer deeper and to try and make sense of it. I've heard a couple of people articulate why it's called that, and I think they're all right. I think it's all legal. I probably called it weapons when I first hit save when I started, and I just never really second-guessed it. So there you go, that's what Cregger says. Here's what I have to say. The characters themselves are the weapons. For example, Josh Brolin's character, Archer, is an absolutely toxic, angry dick the first half of the film, whose child emulates his behavior. Maddie is a bully. We see him picking on Alex in all of Alex's flashbacks. Archer is the weapon, and therefore he creates a weapon, which is in line with what Jay said earlier about the home being what creates the shooters, not the shooters themselves. But Archer isn't the only weapon in the film. The police officer, Paul, is also a weapon even before he gets possessed. The teacher character, Mrs. Gandy, also creates a weapon in both Paul and his wife through the affair that she has with Paul when she encourages him to break his sobriety and skip the AA meeting. The way both Paul and his wife chase people, Paul, the drug addict played by the kid from Euphoria, and his wife chasing Mrs. Gandy through the liquor store and just sort of subtly attack people, is eerily similar to the way Marcus, when possessed by Aunt Gladys, chases Mrs. Gandy through the town. Family, abuse, neglect, addiction are the real weapons here. And not only that, but on the note of family, the film is full of allusions to The Shining, both the book and the film. Or maybe they're just coincidental, I don't know. But I feel like the film is too famous and too similar to weapons to be a coincidence. So make of this what you will. Anyway, 217 is the time all the kids disappear. It's the number on the gun that Archer sees. But 217 is also the room number in the novel version. But we also have this clear imagery and homage to The Shining of the abusive parent breaking their face through the door to hurt a family member, the alcoholism, and a child simply living in perpetual fear of their family. But in The Shining, the real weapon is not an axe or a mallet. It is, of course, addiction, just like in weapons. Zach Cregger's previous film, Barbarian, I think is also relevant to the conversation of weapons because they do have some thematic overlap, particularly in what they portray as the real horror. Both films are concerned, I think, in different ways with the type of suburban rot and decay which has been present in horror for a really long time. But the type of suburban rot and decay on display in these films is different than what we see in classic depictions of the same thing. The suburban rot and horror of the 2020s is not the same as the suburban rot of the 70s, 80s, 90s, or even the 2000s. And one of the things that has changed suburban rot and decay in its portrayal in horror is, of course, school shootings. But I do think it's interesting that at the end of the film we have the sequence where all the kids are chasing Aunt Gladys through homes and yards and things and destroying things, similar to Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Though in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, this destruction of the suburban home is played for comedy, and in Weapons, it's played for commentary. In other words, I think it's a very metamodernist type of commentary that's building not only on shared social consciousness, but also on movies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Justin Chang kind of touched on this in a pretty good article, or I guess analysis, that he wrote for NPR News when he said that Maybrook is in many ways the quintessential American anytown, pretty and idyllic on the surface, but riven by issues of addiction, poverty, and police brutality. The children's disappearance evokes both the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s and the continual tragedy of school shootings, something the film makes explicit with a hallucinatory image of a semi-automatic weapon looming over someone's house like a ghost. We have clear suburban and small-town problems on display here, but unlike in even something as casual as Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the problems here are impossible to solve. I came across a blog by an author named John Pastelli talking about weapons extensively that I thought was pretty interesting and applied to this as well. And this is a bit of a long excerpt, so just please be patient with me, as I think there is something of value here beneath all of the verbose language. So John Pastelli writes, "Speaking of extremism, forget Eddington. Weapons turned out to be the true hardcore reactionary pandemic revenge movie. Critics have decided to talk about everything else. It's about alcoholism, it's about gun control, it's about consumerism, it's about fungus. But no, it's about a sick old woman who sacrifices a group of school children for her health, only to see those youth rise up and tear her limb from limb. There's some stuff about cordyceps for the nerds, some stuff about addiction for the shrinks, and some stuff about guns for the libs. But the underlying unconscious, unwholesome fantasy, and if a horror movie doesn't convey an underlying unconscious, unwholesome fantasy, it will be ignored and forgotten. Horror movies are what Freud thought dreams were, is the sparagmos of the witch, the youth revolt slaughter of the elderly parasite, the disarticulation of a social order coded as both a gynocracy and a gerontocracy. Ugly story, amusingly told. Too long, as most movies are now, but when it abandoned stale, elevated horror stylings for inventively mordant comedy about halfway through, I was sold. I like Aunt Gladys. In a healthier society, Weapons would have been a Mary Poppins comedy fantasy, where witchy Aunt Gladys comes to town and straightens out these alcoholics and junkies and gun nuts' sad lives and teaches them to love with her zany ways. But we live in troublous times, so we get the horror version. There's so much to unpack here, but one of the main things I want to focus on is his mention of Freud. And if you aren't familiar, Freud has this idea of the mind split into multiple levels. There's basically the Freudian iceberg. You've got the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. And essentially, the conscious is the only part of your mind which you can really interact with, and everything below this waterline is somewhat unobtainable. And the closest you can come to accessing these things is through dreams. And we see this portrayed by Archer's dream of the gun in the film, but I think we also see this in how Zach Cregger is trying to explain his methodology behind the film. Pastelli alludes to a wider social horror that we have on display here, and I think the comparison to Mary Poppins is really interesting. The magic in this sense is not here to fix everything. The magic is a symptom which builds on our current social problems like a parasite. It takes advantage of everything bad in our world and just exacerbates it until it's undefeatable and undefinable. This is very similar to what we see in Barbarian, where this small house in a abandoned part of Detroit is just the tip of the iceberg, and the true horror is the history and the foundations and just all of the memories and terror that this building truly holds, which you cannot see from the surface. The society has fundamentally changed, and the problems that we are facing are almost unconfrontable. And when I was doing other research and reading other thoughts on the film and these specific topics, I came across this analysis from a woman named Nora Kenny, writing for a website called The American Conservative. And I don't want to editorialize too much prior to giving you the quote, but this is, I think, one of the worst pieces of criticism that I have ever read in my life. Kenny refers to the film as a post-woke masterpiece because, while some of the film's aesthetics verge on the absurd or postmodern, Aunt Gladys, for instance, is exaggerated to the point of pastiche, the effect isn't a flaw so much as a provocation, activating our natural repulsion to decay. But beneath the self-referential edges poking fun at the Gothic genre, audiences will find no clever inversion, no both sides hand-wringing. Just a simple, unnerving reminder that the stranger isn't always good and the subversive isn't automatically profound just because it's subversive. Sometimes the real moral is unapologetically traditional. The things closest to home are worth protecting, and it's not prudish or bigoted to think so. Family warrants safeguarding, innocence deserves defending, and suspicion can sometimes be a sign of sanity rather than sin. I feel this is completely missing the point of the film and actually misreading the film. Unlike other analyses which deconstruct or interact with the content, this is just taking it at its most dumbest and surface level approach, and I feel loses all the interesting nuance behind the film and what Cregger is trying to do by remaining ambivalent about its deeper meaning. Kenny writes further, ever since the revolutionary 1960s, books and films have rewarded audiences for embracing outsiders while scolding them for distrust of the unknown. Wicked is just one notable example. Instead of setting up a logical dichotomy condemning evil, the Wicked Witch of the West, and affirming goodness, home, safety, Kansas, audiences are made to feel like Salem Inquisitors for failing to recognize that the reclusive green-skinned witch was actually the good character all along. Call it the downstream effects of deconstructionism, post-colonialism, or queer theory, academic frameworks that interrogate power, dismantle binaries, and celebrate otherness. The result has been a narrative logic that reframes stranger danger as intolerance and suspiciousness as pitchfork-wielding Puritanism. Such conventions valorize outcasts while mocking cautious suburbanites and conformists as small-minded, prioritizing the subversion of cliches, the appearance of counterculturalism, and a broader social push toward diversity and tolerance. There, again, is so much to unpack here, and maybe it is a benefit of the film that a criticism like this can exist in such pure contrast to the prior criticism I read from you, from Pastelli or Chang, or even from my high school student. And yet all three of those critics, my high schooler included, I feel are hitting closer to the actual meaning and purpose of the film than Kenny is here. Even though my high schooler doesn't particularly like the film, I think that his dislike is still a product of engaging with the text in fairly good faith, whereas this is just an almost intentionally callous misreading. Kenny's reading totally misses the point of the film. The suspicion is bad. There is a rot beneath things, and everyone, not just Gladys, are weapons. Archer, who is a character she loves because he's a return to the strong, silent, white, straight male protagonist, is the bad guy the first half of the film. He's suspicious of the teacher who we know is innocent. We literally have a pitchfork-wielding mob which chases her to her home and vandalizes her vehicle. You're not supposed to be on the side of these people. They're reacting negatively to someone innocent because they're scared and afraid and small-minded. And while, yes, the horror is a truly satanic one in The Witch, taking that as a positive affirmation of things like the satanic panic or the witch trials or whatever is just, I don't know, taking the metaphor to its most absurdly unstretchable extreme, or maybe the complete opposite, I don't know, but it's wrong in either sense. This reading also completely neglects the fact that weapons and its use of witchery, including its structure and its tonally shift in comedy, as my student pointed out, is intentionally subversive and deconstructive. It doesn't answer everything, and there is not a clean resolution, and I'm blown away by the fact that Kenny could believe that there is. The conflict here is messy and grief-ridden, and Kenny, in true conservative fashion, also neglects to acknowledge any of the real issues behind the witchery in the film, and instead just celebrates that someone weird, a reclusive lady with green skin, ends up being the bad guy. However, I do think that Kenny is somewhat correct in that the violent ending is meant to be unambiguously anti-witch, or in this case, anti-evil, or what the witch represents, and the reason that Kenny latches on to the film as positive due to this ending of Catharsis is the same reason that my student kind of, I think, walks away from the ending, because for her it works and for him it does not. And once more, these contrasting viewpoints might be an example of why the film doesn't work, but to me it is why the film, I guess, does work. And this massive tonal shift and violent ending for Gladys is the closest thing to a solution or an answer that the film gives us. Nobody, especially the children, are really okay afterwards. Aunt Gladys has done untold damage, but she's at least been stopped. However, I walk away from this film thinking of those kids who don't speak by the end, and some of whom never will again, and I wonder, what are we going to do the next time Aunt Gladys shows up? How do we prevent the next Aunt Gladys? And how do we disarm the weapons which are used to harm our society and our children and, I mean, everyone?
Some of them even started talking again this year.
The inconsistent tone poses this open-ended question and doesn't wrap the film up in a neat little bow as Kenny seems to think that it does, which again is also why Jay and others don't like it and one of the reasons that I do. But this conclusion is in line with the issues that Cregger is seemingly insisting that he isn't tackling. Addiction, neglect, grief, trauma, and school shootings are difficult, if not almost impossible, to find a social consensus on how to properly address, confront, and stop. And so a couple notes on specifically the school shooting reading of the film. Part of the reason I think this film landed so strongly to me as being about school shootings is because, as I've mentioned, I'm a teacher. I'm a high school teacher. And the meeting at the beginning of the film when all the parents are yelling and screaming at Miss Gandy and blaming the teacher for things they don't understand and weren't even there for really hit home to me because, like, I've been there. I've seen that. That is my reality and something that me and every other teacher on the planet needs to be aware of every day. I've seen the lynch mobs come out for my co-teachers, for my school. It's something that is a very real problem. Everybody wants to point fingers. Nobody ever wants to offer solutions. And Mrs. Gandy's line about Alex and why she wants to visit him even after she's been told not to, when she says,
"We're the only ones left,"
really hit home for me. I think if you aren't in the classroom or aren't close to the classroom, you can sort of forget like how much time teachers and students spend with each other. Like I tell my kids this all the time. I spend more time with them than I do with my girlfriend, with my best friends, with my parents, with my extended family. I spend most of my time with my students. And you form a bond with all of them no matter what because you've gone through something with them that like you don't go through with anybody else. And this is just under normal circumstances. When tragedy strikes, which tragedy often does strike public schools, you lose a student, you lose a teacher, there's an attack, there's anything, there's a connection you have with those kids and those kids have with you that just doesn't exist anywhere else. And that's why I think I feel so sympathetic to Mrs. Gandy because she just wants to work through this thing with the only person in the town who doesn't hate her and who could even come close to possibly understanding what she's going through. Her entire life is those kids, and one day they're just gone, and everybody blames her for them being gone. And that's not to say that the people in the town aren't justified for their anger and their fear because they've lost their children as well. But the way we process grief is what the film is trying to have a conversation about. And unfortunately, scared people often do not process their grief in a positive or helpful way. Like at the end of all this, the kids and Mrs. Gandy and Archer, they're not all just magically okay. They have a lot of work to do. And there's also, beyond the school shooting stuff, some clear COVID inspiration, because that was another huge socially disruptive event that we have just sort of collectively pretended didn't happen. But I think there's an interesting article by Nicole Veneto, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, Nicole, which ties the film directly to No Child Left Behind policies and indicts the government a little bit more. And all of these are to say that it doesn't have to be exclusively a school shooting film, but even if it is, I think it encompasses all these other ideas and traumas and thoughts that are out there culturally, societally for us, particularly involving schools. Like family, neglect, and grief and trauma are all elements of school shootings, but they're not exclusive to school shootings. Like a close buddy of mine, for personal reasons, really connected to the addiction angle and addiction elements of the film, and to him that's what it's about more than it's about school shootings like it is to me. And I think that is fantastic. Nonetheless, people still fixate on minor details like the 217 being an assault weapons ban bill number, and I don't know, maybe that's true or not, but I don't think that those details really matter. I think that different people can walk away with this with such a personal connection, and that all of those readings are valid is what makes this a truly effective and seminal horror film. But I also understand that that's why a lot of people, such as Jay, might not like it. But either way, I think that it's going to be a film which sticks around for a long time and that which people continue to talk about for a while, as other films which kind of cover the same content, such as Antlers from a few years ago, become neglected. And another film that I kind of think is similar to this that people just totally forgot about is The Empty Man, which, while not as cohesive as Weapons, is trying to address some of these wider questions about horror in the same way. So if you like Weapons, check out Antlers or check out The Empty Man and see what you think of all three combined next to each other. But in conclusion, and to wrap all of this up, I like that Cregger refuses to explain things. I don't really often try to seek out what directors or writers are saying about their work because I don't want that illusion shattered or ruined for me, but in this case, I think it's relevant that he's intentionally saying, I refuse. However, what I don't like from Cregger is the implication from himself and from other critics that there is nothing beyond the margins, that it's just a floating gun. Everything in our minds, subconscious or conscious, comes from somewhere. Freud knew this, these critics know this, and Cregger knows this. Horror is an amazing genre because it synthesizes both abstract and personal societal fears into something that is dissectable for personal experience and that you can sort of think through or connect to. But Weapons is exactly the type of horror I love because the horror is unanswerable, because it feels moralistic, as the things I'm most afraid of in life aren't something you can just point a finger at. They're wide problems that almost never have a simple solution or answer, and that's way scarier than a monster that you can simply kill and be done with. The fact that Weapons leaves so much unanswered is what I think will allow people to continue discussing it for so long. And with all of that said, I'd like to turn once again to RB, as I'll call him, so that I don't mispronounce his last name and so people aren't mean to me in the comments. And I hope that maybe this has all given you, and especially my student Jay, a little bit more to think about or chew on in the wider pantheon of Weapons, discourse, and criticism. The modern writer, scripter, is born simultaneously with his text. He is in no way supplied with a being which precedes or transcends his writing. He is in no way the subject of which his book is the predicate. There is no other time than that of the utterance, and every text is eternally written here and now.